The second match of Group B in round 1 was between Radoslaw Wojtaszek and Richard Rapport. Wojtaszek replaced Ding Liren, who had some visa issues. We had one d4, and Rapport chose to play more flexible. He played e6. He was ready for the French, and also for some Nimzo/Bogolyubov structures. c4, and now bishop b4 early on. Of course, he can play knight f6 and go for some Nimzo or Queen's Indian defense, but he went for this. Bishop d2 and now a5. He's trying to hold his bishop on b4 and, in case of some bishop b4, a b4, to hinder the knight from b1 to get to d2, and which is a bit more passive. Now Wojtaszek plays knight f3, knight f6 by Rapport, and now g3, d5, and now bishop g2. Now black captures the pawn, but he's not able to hold on to it too long, because after queen c2, defending the pawn is not really good. After b5, there is always a4, breaking this pawn structure. If you want to keep the structure solid on the queen side, you can go for c6, but after capturing, you cannot recapture back because of bishop b4, using the pin on the a file. And what's unfortunate for black is that he cannot input this because of knight fd2. The rook is under attack, the b5 pawn is going to drop, and then the c4 pawn is also quite vulnerable. Black has to give up this pawn, or white will just capture it back. And he went for c5 here. a3 by Wojtaszek. He doesn't want to recapture with the queen, he wants to recapture with the knight. Rapport took, knight bd2, and cd4, knight c4. The reason why white avoids recapturing with the queen is because that the queen might get under some attack on c4. It's much safer on c2. Rapport castles, queen d3. He's targeting the d4 pawn, and now Rapport tries to hold on to the pawn and also to develop. Wojtaszek also castles, and now rook a6. Rook a6 was looking very strange, but it has a purpose. He wants to play b5 on the next move. It's not possible to do it immediately because of some potential pins on the long diagonal, and also the b5 pawn might get under some strong pressure. If rook b8, there's knight c6. So if knight d5, then you can take first on d4, and still this pressure is too much to bear. After knight d5, you can also consider playing this. Although maybe after bishop a6, he has some pressure on e2. So maybe it's just better to capture first and then put both rooks on the open files and put some pressure on the knight on d5. But he goes for this. Also, b6 was interesting, trying to just fianchetto the bishop. The difference between b6 and b5 is that b6 is less exposed. And in case of knight d4, trying to be concrete, you can take, and white can choose either to capture on c6 immediately, which leads to some balanced position, I would say, because white has slightly worse structure but more space. His pieces are more active. Or if you want to take on d4, they can go bishop a8, but there is bishop a6, and the bishop and the knight are both under attack. If you take, there's rook b8, and again, the knight on b6 is under attack, bishop on a8 is under attack. If white tries something like this, there is knight b3. And after this, g6, white can defend his knight, but there's the knight e8. These pieces don't look stable enough, and it seems like black is equalizing quite comfortably here. But in the game, what happened was Rapport played rook a6. Now rook d1, putting some additional pressure to the pawn on d4. And now b5 by Rapport. Now knight c5 and bishop b7. If he takes on e5 here, knight e5, and tries to hold on to this pawn, white has a nice move, b4, trying to fix this pawn. The d4 pawn will drop at any point, and the point is that after this queen b6 to defend the pawn, there is rook a5, and the b5 pawn is loose, the d4 pawn is loose as well, and it's tough to hold everything together. Also, what I forgot to mention, after knight e5, rook d6, queen b5 would allow some counterplay with the bishop a6 and capturing on e2. So it was better just to play b4 to fix the b pawn, and the idea was to, after this, have queen b5 next without allowing bishop a6. Rapport played bishop b7, and now again queen b5 is impossible because of rook b6 and black gets too much play. Wojtaszek took on c6, bishop c6 and queen d4. Finally the d pawn is dropped. Now queen a8, trying to stop knight e5 because the bishop hangs at this moment. Wojtaszek plays rook a c1 and now h6 by Rapport, and now bishop f1 by Wojtaszek. Very smart move, trying to prepare knight e5, and now it's risky to capture the pawn on f3 like this, because there is bishop b5, and with the extra pawn on the queen side, it's tough to defend this position. Also, at the moment, rook on a6 is weird, so the only move to save the game is e5, but after exchanging queens after this, the rook on c7 is dominating the whole position. The knight on f6 doesn't have good prospects. You can see that you have some options like bishop c4 targeting f7, immobilizing this rook on f8. Also connecting it with a passed pawn on b file, it's a really bad position for black. So Rapport doesn't take on f3, he goes bishop d5. Knight goes to e5 and now queen b8. Although it was better to go rook a7 here, because you want to get out from this potential pin on the f1 a6 diagonal. And in case of some rook c5 to get rook b7 and try to push for some counterplay with b4, a4, b4. He goes for this, and Wojtaszek plays f3. Very, very clever move, preparing e4 and putting pressure on b5. Rook goes to d6, and you might think that this is a blunder, because what happens on e4? The bishop cannot move from d5 and you lose the piece. But in that case, black goes for rook d8. And in case of e d5, there's rook d5 and the knight on e5 is lost. e4 is a premature move. Wojtaszek plays queen c5 here. Rook a6 back. He tries to escape this pin, but also the problem is that after this there was e4 with knight c6 next, if the bishop goes to c4. So he goes to a6, and now the position becomes really, really unpleasant. Bishop c4 by black. They exchanged, and now after e4, Rapport decides to sacrifice a pawn by rook a b6. He didn't want to allow this, and with these rooks disconnected, white's play is very easy in this case, because black will never get the control over the c and d file. White can do simple things like expanding on the king side by g4, h4, g5, and that's something that Rapport didn't want to allow. He wanted to have some active counterplay, and he played rook a b6, trying to anticipate this with bc and putting some pressure on the b2 pawn. And in case of this, play rook b3 and to have something similar like in the game. After this, Wojtaszek first plays rook d2. He's hoping that Rapport will change his mind and capture on f1, which would lead to a much easier game for white. But he goes for g5. For example, if he went for this, king f1 and a4, that could promise something, because next is b4, and maybe white has to go to d3 to stop somehow this counterplay, but now he would allow black to get rook d8, maybe put some pressure on the knight. So maybe this was the best choice for Rapport, to capture on f1 and to go for a4. But he goes for g5 and now g4 by Wojtaszek, trying to stop things like h5 and g4 to weaken the e4 pawn. King g7, and now he took on c4, takes, and knight c4. White is a pawn up, but he still has issues with advancing these pawns. He goes for this, attacking the f3 pawn, king f2, and now a4. And for the moment it looks like black is holding everything together. Rook cc2, trying to free his knight, and now Rapport starts counterplay on the king side by h5. Tries to somehow break those pawns. Wojtaszek just holds them with h3. This was the critical moment in the game, I would say. Here, Rapport chose to capture on g4, but it was better to play h4 to keep this h3 pawn alive. Imagine white's knight getting to g6 and f4 somehow, hitting the pawn on h3. It could be quite annoying to handle this. Rapport makes a mistake here and he takes on g4, hg, and now rook h8. He wanted to go from this side, knight e5, trying to defend the f3 pawn in case some check happens on the h2. So you can have just king g1 and exchange rooks without losing the f3 pawn. So he went back to b5, knight goes to d3, and now rook h2, king f1, and he took on d2, took and knight d7. And now black doesn't have so much grip on the b3 pawn. Now with one pair of rooks exchanged, it's tougher to generate some counterplay. There's always some idea like f5 to liquidate pawns on this side to make it easier for black to play for a draw. Now Wojtaszek activates his king, king f6, rook c2, and rook b8. And after rook c4, now the a4 pawn is under lots of pressure, and now Rapport doesn't want to be passive with rook a8, so he goes for knight e5. The rook endgame is not good because after this the king gets too active in case of some captures. The king is just way too dangerous now. The rook endgame doesn't feel right for white. And how to avoid rook endgame? Well, by playing this. And now if rook c8 there is rook a4, because after this you have two pawns here. I think it's enough for white to convert. So Rapport had to exchange rooks, knight b4, and now maybe the last chance to make some counterplay was to play king e7. And after knight d3, something similar happened in the game, knight c4, and if he wanted to get closer to the queenside by king c2, king c3, then to play f5 to liquidate these pawns like I told before. And now if you don't do anything, if you keep it like this, then black is going to capture and go knight e3. And then the g4 pawn becomes quite vulnerable. So you can capture twice, but now after king f6, it's kind of a race because you need to abandon your pawn on f3 if you want to capture on a4. Let's say king c2, knight e3, takes, king b4, knight d4. Now the f3 pawn is under attack, knight e1, but now you have king f5, and it seems like black has a very good counterplay. If king a4, king f4, and now black takes on f3, and now white has two choices, king b4, or just to start pushing immediately. The issue with b4 is that after capturing, and knight d3 is risky because of king e3, and the knight cannot stop the g pawn. But after this, you can also do this and start pushing, but after simultaneously queening, the reason why is this a draw is that the a pawn is there, and queen trades don't work in every case, especially when the king gets closer to the corner. It doesn't allow him to escape from checks so easily, like with the b pawn. And that's why after king f4, king b4 would be the best. And after this, taking a4, and now we have again the same situation. They queen at the same time, but the position is much easier for white. The b pawn is there, and you can potentially escape when the checks come and start pushing and hiding at the same time. This should be winning, but it requires very good technique to achieve that. We saw what was the best chance for Rapport. He didn't do it, and he played knight c4 immediately, which allowed knight d3. Although here he had a chance to finish it with knight c6, stopping any king e7, king e5 ideas, and in case of knight b5, to just first cage the king and then to trap the knight by knight a5. And then next moves are going to be king d2, king c2, capturing the knight. In case of e5 in this case, and after this king c3, and just head towards the a pawn. And if he tries this, then after knight a5, knight c4 is coming next, after which black eventually gives up the pawn. Let's say this, and Even if you capture on f3, it's too slow. Black is simply too slow, and white's going to push his pawns. This was the quicker way to finish the game, but knight d3 is also quite good. King e7, king d1, and now we got a big race. Also, what I forgot to mention, that here f5 was also the last chance to try to fight for something. Play this, he allowed the king to get to c3 without any problems, king b5, and now king d4 by white. The king cannot move. If the knight moves, then there is knight e5, and the f7 pawn is under attack, and it's going to drop at any moment. So f6 is played to stop knight e5, but now white has e5, tries to break those pawns. If you take on e5, there is knight e5. You cannot capture because of f4, and this g pawn is just too fast. After something like this, you can play g6, and there's this, and after king f8, knight f5, now knight h4, deflecting this knight, and in case of this, to go for g7 and knight f5 next. So Rapport tried to go for f5, but now Wojtaszek plays this, and now there's the passed e pawn. e6 was played, and now he tried something desperately. He tried to create a passed pawn by g4, e7, knight d6, and king d5 by white, knight e8, and now f4. Keeping this f1 alive, not worrying about the g passed pawn. Now he tried with g3, but after knight e1, knight g7, knight g2, now the idea is to get to e3 first before the king gets closer, because you want to stop king c4 at any point. You don't want any counterplay against the b pawn and potentially getting the a passed pawn. Just first secure the c4 square and then go and promote the e pawn. Now we had this, and after queening, Rapport resigned, because after this, you cannot even get to d4 because of knight f5, and after this, eventually white gets to a4 pawn and it's lost. That's it. If you have any questions, let me know in the comment section and I'll answer to you. See you soon, and bye.